Hero Time! Chapter 43. Results. Cooper called the next day. He was ready to test the gun. Jen's parents dropped her off at his house. She still had to pick up her bag and her hoverboard from him, too. She hadn't told her parents that this was where she'd gone when she'd run off. Gwen was taking some time to work on some schoolwork she'd been assigned by her teachers over the summer break. Jen had never been more grateful not to go to Gwen's fancy prep school. Kevin was working at Ed's today, so Jen was on her own as she stepped into Cooper's house. Not that she minded. Cooper was less distractible when Gwen wasn't around and less nervous without Gwen's boyfriend endlessly teasing. Mrs. Daniels smiled at her. "Hello again. You didn't need to stay as long as I thought you would." Jen grinned. "Yep, got things worked out at home." "Glad to hear it. You're still welcome over any time, dear. And you know, Cooper could do with getting out a bit more." Jen nodded as she made her way back to the back door and the shed that Cooper called his lab. "He's single, you know, dear." Jen grimaced out of Mrs. Daniels' view at that and waved over her shoulder. She entered the shed with a knock, and Cooper nodded to her from in front of one of his computers. "Your mom is trying to set us up. Just a heads up." Cooper spluttered into his Coke. Jen laughed. He joined her after a moment before nodding to a red gun sitting on the table. The circuits running through it were a pulsing, glowing green, but the plating on the gun was bright red. "Fine-tuned the coding last night. If we did it right, it should work." Jen grimaced at the word should. She never liked that word. It left too much up to chance, but with this gun they could be sure of nothing. Only that it was a chance of tipping the battle in their favor. She picked it up. It was much lighter than the laser lance she'd handled. Though that could be because the last time she'd used an actual gun, she was 10, and it was about the same length as her torso. This looked much more like the laser lances Kevin had been selling to the Forever Knights. "You ready to test this?" Cooper looked apprehensive, but nodded to her. The two of them went down to the containment room together. The two remaining DNAliens hissed at them, but could do nothing else. There were splatters of goo on the walls, but both creatures were still bound with energy cuffs. Cooper flicked a switch on one of his computers and looked up into the web camera. "DNA gun test 1. After working with the information provided by Jennifer Tennyson and the Omnitrix, we now have a testable prototype." He turned to Jen, who nodded at him. He was, of course, recording their experiment, like any good scientist. They had talked about it and agreed between the two of them that Jen would test the gun. Kevin had offered to do it, but it didn't seem right for him to have to take the fall if something went wrong. Jen stepped up to the wall and aimed at the closest DNAlien. She glanced back at Cooper. "Ready?" He nodded, hand hovering over a button. It was only shaking a little bit as Jen turned back to the DNAliens. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Cooper hit the switch, and a chunk of the wall in front of Jen vanished. She fired at the first DNAlien, a bolt of green light sailing into the creature. It blackened for a moment while both humans held their breaths. Then the DNAlien's skin fell away, leaving behind an unharmed human who blinked at them, confusedly, as the xenocyte fell to the floor. It was blackened and dead. Jen cried out in triumph and re-aimed at the second DNAlien, firing without the countdown this time, to the same effect. Cooper whooped with joy as Jen tossed him the gun and went for the keys to the energy cuffs so she could free the newly cured humans. It took them some time to get the confused humans sorted out. Either the gun or the removal of the xenocyte seemed to induce amnesia, though it wasn't too severe. Jen wondered if Ken had escaped that because of his alien heritage or because his transformation hadn't been complete when she'd cured him. Mrs. Daniels hadn't remembered what she'd done as a DNAlien, just the events before and after. Once Mrs. Daniels had loaded the still confused humans into her car with a story of how she'd found them, and was on her way to the hospital, the two teens sat down to talk. "Well, it worked." Jen was all smiles as Cooper's fingers flew across the keyboard, going back over the results of their test. "Better than we anticipated, even. Aside from the memory loss and their time attached to the parasite, there was no damage to the host, according to my sensors." Jen nodded at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "It's probably better they don't remember their time as a DNAlien." Cooper flinched and nodded. Jen clapped him on the shoulder. "Okay, so now we need to make more. How much material do you have left? Cooper did a quick bout of mental math. Enough to make 7, maybe. The problem is they take a lot of power. When you do it, the Omnitrix is using your natural energy as a backup power reserve. I ran the math on it. You'd have to cure about 6 people, maybe 7, to start feeling more negative effects than the 2 you cured back to back. You just got tired and hungry after that, right? Very hungry and very tired. She nodded. You'd have to cure quite a few people in a row to actually pass out, but I'd be careful about it for a bit. But with the guns, we need a level 5 power source, and planet Earth is only a level 2. It's hard to get my hands on the stuff to power it. But I have enough for about 7, if we're lucky. Jen nodded at Cooper, knowing he'd likely gotten what he had from Kevin already. Between all of us, that'll have to be enough. Cooper frowned. We have 7 people against an army? Jen reached around Cooper and flicked off his recorder. I've gone up against a warlord and his army alone without the use of the Omnitrix. I've seen worse odds and seen the other side. Do what you can as fast as you can, please. We need to make our move soon. Cooper nodded, his mouth set in a hard line. Jen gripped his shoulder. We can do this, Cooper. Right now, we're a step ahead of them. Let's keep it that way. Cooper grinned slightly, looking a bit more confident. Jen wished she could be as confident as she sounded. 7 was being generous, honestly, and counting a person she hadn't actually contacted yet. As of that moment, they had Jen herself, Gwen, Kevin, Alan Albright, Julie, and Cooper, the last 2 of whom didn't really count, as neither of them were fighters like the rest. Jen left Cooper's house on her hoverboard, thankful for the drizzle and the resulting cloud cover. She headed for the rust bucket. It was a good place to think, sitting in the passenger seat, curled up, watching the rain. At some point, she lost track of time and got bored. She began digging through the papers and notebooks Grandpa Max kept there. It was some of the only things that hadn't been disturbed when Arjit got his hands on the rust bucket. Little did he know, some of the most valuable things in this whole rig were here, not in the tech. Like the little black book Jen now held in her hands. It was something that she'd seen Grandpa Max use once or twice, and it contained contact information for every plumber on the planet, at least the ones he knew of. Several of the numbers were scribbled out, but only a few replaced with new numbers. Some of them were numbers that couldn't be cell phones, either too long or far too short to be an earthly phone number. Towards the back of the book, she found the name she recognized, though she hadn't seen it in years. Victor Validus's name was scratched out in marker, and it made Jen frown. She could tell it was his because Ethan's name was still mostly legible beneath it. Jen pulled out her phone and squinted at the number barely legible under the ink and attempted to cover it. She managed to type up the number and took a deep breath before hitting the call button. She waited as the line rang and rang. "This is Ethan. Leave a message after the beep. I'll get back to you when I can." The beep was loud, and Jen flinched. "Hey, Ethan, it's Jen. Jen Tennyson? Look, I know your dad left the plumbers, but I need help. Look, I don't have time to explain it over a message. Call me back as soon as you get this, please." She clicked off the call and shook her head. It should not have been that hard. He was just another plumber's kid. Except he wasn't. He hadn't been her first crush, but they had a history. Ethan's father had been a plumber, but a few years ago he'd quit out of the blue and left town, taking his son with him. Jen hadn't heard from either of them since, which had been a bit of a blow. She and Ethan had been close. He'd stuck up for her when she tried out for soccer, which, at the time, had been all boys. Add to that the fact that he had been her first kiss, and him vanishing off the face of the planet stung. They had only been 13 at the time, true. It had been awkward, and they'd laughed about it after, but they'd never gotten a chance to talk about it, as Ethan and his father had vanished a few days after. Shaking her head, Jen went back to skimming through the names in the book. She was looking for ones she knew, or at least had heard of. She knew better than most that not all plumbers could be trusted. Grandpa Max's old partner, Phil, was evidence of that. The first time they'd met, he had been releasing aliens from the null void so people would pay him to take care of them. The second time, he'd been a giant bug monster alien thing that had attacked them, turned back into Phil for only a moment before staring at them vacantly and vanishing. She paused, her finger ran down the names on a page. That was a name she knew. Wes Green. And his phone number were written in her grandfather's neat handwriting. Underneath was a name of the old plumber's granddaughter, Kai, Jen's first real crush. Jen swore under her breath. It wasn't that there was bad blood there. It was that Kai hadn't wanted a girlfriend. She'd wanted a pet werewolf. It had been one of the first times someone had outright told her they preferred her as someone else. If she was honest, it still sort of messed with her head. She saw it much easier these days, but it didn't make it easier. She had typed in the number before she fully realized what she was doing. She was about to hit call when her phone began to ring and she jumped. She almost lost her grip on it and glanced at the caller ID. It was Kevin. Hey, Kev. Jen, we got a hit on the scans I've been running on local calls, keeping an ear out for alien activity. Kid out in the desert somehow got an oscillator key away from the DNAliens. They've got him locked up in the highway patrol station, not too far from here. We gotta go, now. Where are you? I'm at the rust bucket. Okay, I'll be there in 2 minutes. Jen nodded and hung up. She glanced down at her phone as she scrambled for her shoes. Kai's number was still displayed on the screen. She quickly hit save as she raced outside to meet Kevin. She had no idea if she would have time to contact the girl anytime soon, but it didn't hurt to have her number just in case, right? Chapter 44. Key. The man who dove into Kevin's car at the highway patrol to escape the DNAliens was ordinary, or at least appeared to be. But he knew quite a lot about the DNAliens, almost too much. He'd managed to get an oscillator key away from a nest of Highbreed, but he had no memory except of his name and the fact that he probably played the bass. It wasn't until she saw the wreck that Jen put two and two together. Once they'd driven off the DNAliens guarding the key, Jen turned her attention to the cab of the truck. She was listening to Tyler. The Highbreed needed the key in La Soledad. The Arch was some kind of gateway, nearly ready to bring forth an army of Highbreed, a full fleet ready to mow down humanity. It was not good news. But something here didn't add up. The cab of the truck was wrecked, nearly beyond recognition. She turned back to Tyler. There wasn't a scratch on him. You sure know a lot about what they're planning. Gwen's statement was laced with a small amount of suspicion. Jen hopped off the wreck of the cab. Yeah, I think I know why. You said you crashed this, she asked, stepping over to Tyler, as he nodded, looking confused but hopeful. Yeah, what is that? Jen interrupted him by reaching up and peeling off the ID mask from his face as Gwen gasped and Kevin swore. You're a DNAlien. No way a regular human is walking away from a wreck like that, Jen said, tossing the ID mask to Kevin, who barely caught it. Before Tyler had too much time to freak out, they were attacked again, and this time it didn't go so well. Given the split-second choice between saving Tyler and saving the key, Jen took a chance. She managed to get off a single shot from Jet Ray's tail as the door closed, but there was no way of knowing if she'd actually hit anything. She adjusted Tyler and went in for a landing. When the four of them were once again standing on the ridge where the truck had been, Kevin and Gwen shook their heads at her. Not so sure I agree with your decision there, Jen. No offense, Tyler, but one life against the world isn't much of a competition. Kevin said, and Tyler nodded. No sacrifices. Jen said it firmly. We've seen how that path ends up, and I don't like it. Tyler collapsed to his knees, head in his clawed hands. You'd rather save a monster than the world. I'm doomed anyway. It was Jen's turn to shake her head. See, that's what you don't get. She reached out, and the Omnitrix beeped. Genetic damage detected. Attempt to repair? Yep. This time it was much, much faster, Gwen noted. It took only a moment for the xenocyte to fall into Jen's hands, blackened and dead as the DNAlien skin sloughed off. Tyler was left looking much like he had with the ID mask on. Gwen smiled as she pulled a compact mirror out of her purse and handed it to him. He blinked at his reflection. How? Jen shrugged. I'm good with DNA. Kevin shook his head. What now? Jen took a deep breath. Now you and Gwen go check on Cooper. See if you can't do anything to speed up his timetable. Drop me and Tyler off at Ed's. I'll take him to the hole. You still remember what you saw at the nest? Tyler nodded, looking determined. Any way I can help. I was hoping you'd say that. Kevin nodded again as Jen turned to them. As of right now, we are on high alert. Let the others know. There's a war starting any day now, and we need to make sure we win it. Jen unlocked the door to the mechanic's shop with a key Ed had given her. Tyler looked confused. You work here? Jen shrugged, locking the door behind her before leading him to the hidden elevator. Sort of. She stepped into the elevator and motioned him inside. When they reached the bottom, she spoke. Clearance allowed, status witness, name Tyler, access code 10657801. Access granted. A computerized voice spoke, and the lights came up as Tyler stared around. Welcome to the hole, currently the only operating plumber base on Earth. It hadn't been the only one when Jen was a kid. Mount Rushmore had been reactivated after she got the Omnitrix, but after she gave it up, alien activity went back to here and there and mostly harmless. The base inside the monument had been shut down not too long after she turned 12. Tyler raised an eyebrow. Plumber? The highly ironic name for an organization of space cops. Tyler laughed lightly as Jen led him away from the main console room. She took him down a maze of hallways to a room that very much resembled a break room in an office building, but much more comfortably furnished. The couch was large and comfortably plush. There were a few armchairs and a fridge alongside a sink and cabinets. Grab a seat. I'm going to make some tea. You want anything? Tyler laughed a little nervously. It's not like some weird alien mix, is it? Jen shrugged, going through the boxes on the shelves. If you're feeling adventurous, we do have some of those. Spraganant? I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. Something called ambrosia, but I brought some chamomile, rose, ginger, and green tea. Green tea, please. Jen nodded and set an electric teapot to boil. Once the tea was ready, she set it on the table in front of Tyler. Sorry, all we have is honey. She set a small plastic bear next to the tea with a plastic spoon. He nodded. No, I appreciate it. He poured a few spoonfuls of honey into his tea. Jen set a small silver device down in front of the mugs, between the two of them. That's a recorder, so we don't have to write everything down. Do you mind? Tyler shook his head. Good. She flicked a button on that Tyler didn't see on the side of the recorder. If you could tell me everything you know, anything you remember about your time as a DNAlien. He nodded. His account was detailed and long. Between the two of them, they went through 2 pots of tea before he even reached overhearing the hybrid talking about the planned invasion of Earth. He glanced at Jen and she nodded for him to keep going. He did, going through everything he remembered from that day. When he concluded, with Jen curing him, she nodded and flicked off the recorder. Thank you, Tyler. He looked down at the dregs of his tea. I wish there was more I could do. Jen shook her head. You've done more than you know. Let's get you home. He nodded. As it turned out, he had a girlfriend who had been running around frantic trying to find him for the last 3 weeks. She was more than happy to come get him. Jen waved as the car pulled away. She hoped Tyler would be okay. She'd noticed him subtly checking for an ID mask, running his fingers across her cheek. Well, at least he hadn't manhandled her face like he'd done in Kevin's car when they'd first picked him up. She'd given him her number in case he ran across any more trouble with aliens. She went back into the hole and connected the holo recorder to the mainframe. Upload this to my DNAlien file and open a new log in that file. Mark it urgent and send the whole pack to the Magister. She turned to the computer with a built-in camera and nodded. Magister, that conspiracy my grandfather was looking into, the one that got Magister Labrid killed, they're nearly done with their plan. They have possession of an oscillator key. They're building a hyperspace jump gate in Los Soledad. They're planning on bringing the hybrid fleet through and wiping out Earth. I need all the help I can get down here. Contact me through Gwen or Kevin's badges as soon as you can. I'm attaching testimony from a cured DNAlien. Please don't blow me off about this. There are millions of lives on the line. She sent the message along with the DNAlien file. She honestly wasn't sure if the Magister was ignoring her or not these days. He might just be busy. She had a sinking suspicion that was the case, something Tyler had overheard the Highbreeds say was raising the hair on the back of her neck. The hybrid fleet will roll over this world as it will all others. Earth wasn't their only target. That thought made her stomach twist in fear. How were they supposed to stop an army that wasn't just planning to roll over Earth, but the galaxy, possibly the universe? From what Riney had said when they were trapped on the desert planet together, she could only guess at the scope of the plan. She glanced at a photo on her desk. It was one Grandpa Max had brought down here, of him, Jen, and Gwen during the first summer they had all spent together. Really wish you'd come back with me, Grandpa Max. This is way bigger than we ever thought it was. She shook her head. She needed a smoothie and some chili fries after the day she'd had.